This is how we play.
There is something about an encapsulation that we have to talk about, which is sort of hard to describe, but basically, as I said, some of these modules or adventures start out in a town or revolve around a town, whereas in others, the isolation and not being able to get to a town might be an issue, right? Like the Sinister Secrets of Saltmarsh is a place where you are is not safe. I think that in the Giants, the Giants attack the place that you're in. And as I scroll down, that seems to be immediately happening on the cover of the next one too, right? Red Hand of Doom is like the first adventure path that was ever done, I think, that was the 3rd edition, 2006 according to this. And in Red Hand of Doom, the orc armies are amassing and threatening all of the civilization in the region. So the civilization is not necessarily safe, but it's there and you know where it is. If we're talking about Tomb of Behedia, it might be important that there isn't necessarily a town nearby where you can do stuff. The towns certainly aren't safe in Curse of Strahd. There's not going to be a town in the Lost Island module that I'm talking about. Is there going to be a town in the Cursed Ziggurat adventure? Probably not. I might not use the Manor of Mortheim Ansler, but I might put them together, sort of like Against the Giants is, where I have 3 of them, and make that into a super module. We said that you have to put straight up front what it is that it's about. Usually the villain or monster or whatever it is, right up front so that the Dungeon Master knows immediately what they're dealing with and what this is about and how to use it. But then part of the flesh that you're going to put on that is understanding what the module's area is. And Yawning Portal has its own thing where the Yawning Portal is what it is that connects even the modules it uses together. And that's something you have to know what that's like. There's 2 modules that I ran. This was many, many years ago, and I ran them in a competition. I took 1st place in one of the competitions and 2nd place in the other one. Although I think that competitive Dungeons & Dragons is a fucking silly thing. It probably shouldn't be. I think it's an anathema to gaming and bad for gaming culture that it even exists.
Well, I mean, like, I've had players in the past who were and their immediate question was, how do I win?
Yeah,
because it's a game, right? So obviously, it's a competitive experience. As far as I'm concerned, the object to D&D, the goal, the way you win the game, is by having fun telling a story with your friends.
Anyway,
that's how you win D&D.
So there were 2 modules, and I don't even remember what they were. I was trying to find them in preparation for this, and I couldn't find them. And I think that they were probably newly released materials when I ran this in, oh, good grief, before 4th edition was announced. Shortly after 3.5, I think, so a millennium ago. One of them took place in the town of Seawall, and there's a description of Seawall, and you get to know Seawall. It's a neat little place. It's very similar to the town of Honnit or of Orlais in the older modules I was describing. Temple of Elemental Evil and Against the Reptile God, respectively. But it's a useful thing to know and to be able to work with. And you're like, okay, so we find something during this adventure. Spoilers, at the end of the adventure, it turns out that like the whole reason they brought you here is because the lake went dry, and you're on an adventure to try to figure out what happens to the lake in this expedition, and somebody put a magical sponge of drying at the bottom of the lake, and it absorbed the entire lake. So you have to like disenchant the sponge in order to get the lake back, and it's hilarious. Because that's like a town got punked, and its existence was brought into it faced an existential threat because of a practical joke that went a little too far, and I just thought that was gorgeous. But the other one took place in a jungle, and a big part of what makes this little adventure what it is that you got off a ship, you're going into that jungle to find something. If you come back out alive, you get back on the ship and you leave. There's no town. There's no civilization to be had here. There's nowhere to sell things you find. There's nowhere to buy ammunition or spell components. And that's a very important part of what makes that module what it is. That's something else that you need to think about too, is like, once you have the first thing out of the way, in Cult of the Reptile God, there's this evil Naga that the reptile people are worshipping that has taken over a nearby boathouse that has become a dungeon, right? A dungeon full of monsters. And that's the thing that the Dungeon Master needs to know coming in right up front. But what makes it what it is that it has this town of Orlais where people don't know what's going on, who might be a cult member, who might not be, what's happening with these violent lizards. And that's the next.
Understanding the world, a lot of that comes from understanding the people, the characters, who is in this world. So when you're writing in either a module or a full-on campaign for yourself, you need to be thinking about what kinds of characters are the players going to be and how do they impact the world. That's how you make your world feel alive and breathing. It's why in a lot of the D&D settings you get a stat block for your character and you get a list of these are their objectives and motives. This is what they're going to try and do. So based on, how you're playing do stuff, this is how these characters are likely to react to certain. What they don't is just say, this is what the character does, period. They don't give you a set path for that, because players are so unpredictable and can go off in so many wild and strange different directions that it's virtually impossible to track exactly how they do how they're going to influence the setting. So as a result, the characters who are in the campaign, NPCs, need to be dynamic and flexible as well, because otherwise players are just going to get left in the dust. Or the players are going to create these weird off-the-rails situations, and you'll have these NPCs where the DM's just like, I don't know what to do with the character because it says they do this, but that's not possible anymore because the players have derailed me.
Yeah. Just because a lot of it's already written down for you, by the way, doesn't mean that it's going to be set in stone or easy.
Yeah. One of the examples I have is that I have this oasis location that I use in the Tomb of Bahidi, the desert campaign that I'm. And there's the city of Al-Hissin. Boswin Abraxas is this noble character who is in charge of the oasis. He has, all of his wealth is built up around the fact that he's got the only really stable source of water in the region. So as a result, he's very wealthy. He, of course, has hired a whole bunch of guards to protect water. He's very, very, very pompous and attempts to eschew all power in the region under himself. So if a character shows up with a create water Kent and is creating water for people, then that's someone he's going to want to either have under his control or he's going to want them dead as soon as possible. And honestly, he's going to want the players dead as soon as he knows what they're up to, because if they release genies and bring water back, then he loses his monopoly, he loses his power base. Mm-hmm. So that creates this NPC who has the motivation. He's got power in the region, he's got these guards, soldiers, and these big walls around him, so that gives him his power to influence the players and the world of the campaign around him. So there's two aspects of that character right then. You've got his personality, he's pompous, controlling, entitled, and maybe just a bit snooty about, he's sort of that, when my father hears about this sort of character, only he's, grown up and is now in charge of the place. You give these characters their depth, create these powerful, important characters, and then you allow them to shape the world around them in accordance with players, and that's what makes the world feel like it's living and breathing.
Yeah. Speaking of memorable NPCs, for those competitions, I always added my own NPC, a very heavily flavored character. I don't remember what order I did it in. I think that the Whistle of the Nihilist was the first one. But the Whistle of the Nihilist, I'd been looking at the Horn of Valhalla, which in 3rd edition, you blew the Horn of Valhalla and it summoned D4 level 3 barbarians or something.
It still exists in 5th edition. I gave it to a party of players, summoned a ton of barbarians on, and yeah, lesson learned about magic items. We're going to talk about magic items later, but please continue.
Anyway, yeah, and it's different iterations do different things, obviously. But I'd been thinking about that, and I was like, what if you just summoned one NPC that was like an actual, more or less NPC, but sort of like a shadow of a person because it's not the real individual, right? I was like, that's kind of a neat idea, because where the hell are these barbarians coming from? Valhalla, presumably. But I thought, okay, so I wanted this character that was sort of inspired by a combination of Cloud Strife and Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII. So he's just like this gloomy, dorky edgelord character who's extremely dangerous using an outrageously long single-bladed sword, dressed all in black. He's got a very low AC, but who cares? because if he's destroyed, then you just summon him again the next time you blow the whistle. And he's only around for a minute anyway when you blow the whistle.
I love it. And then I imagine he's like, what does it even matter if I get hit? Who cares if I take damage?
Yeah.
It's just another meaningless number taken away from my hit points. There's a lot of fun stuff you can do with that character.
Yeah, that character is why I did well in the competition. Because that was treasure. That character was treasure. Somebody found the whistle, blew it, and this asshole showed up and made everybody laugh. And everybody loved having him there. And sometimes they'd blow the whistle when they'd made camp just to talk to him. So the other one was a bandit, because it said somewhere in the module you get attacked by bandits. And I was like, boring! So instead, I had the party assaulted by a single bandit who was of much higher level, who had a cursed sword that he was that was fused to him. They fought him for a while, but I tried to make it clear that they might have had the chance to work with this person. Because in the module it describes trying to get the bandits to work with you, and then you have manpower. But this guy working with you would just be stupendous, right? But his cursed sword makes him a liability, as opposed to just bandits you can't trust because they're bandits. And it was super interesting and memorable. So you can still put your own touch on a lot of these things. You have to take it easy with modules. Get in, say it, and get out in a module, because it's got to be fast. But on an adventure path, half of the characters in the Descent into Avernus game I'm running aren't from the book. They're characters that are part of the backstories of the players' characters who they've built, and are related to them in some way. And the way that those characters work with the world gives me more ways for the player characters to find connections and to find other people and to have resources in the world that can move the campaign forward when stuff happens. Because there's actually a surprising amount of hand-holding in Descent into Avernus, which I think is because it's so weird. Because that's something else you might consider in modules too. How easily communicated are the things you're trying to do? Because in the original, I keep bringing up Cult of the fucking Reptile God. I've never, until very recently, I didn't even know that existed. I just can't get it out of my head. But anyway, in Cult of the Reptile God, the way it was originally written in the first instance, they don't even tell you that anything is happening as a player. As a player, it's like, there's a dungeon? All right, let's go. That's what this game, it's in the title of the game. Of course we're going to the dungeon. There's no, reason to go there. There's no adventure hook. There's no hook at all. The hook is a dungeon exists. Go, man, go. What's wrong with you? Why are you not already in the dungeon? One of you should be dead by now. The rest of you should be arguing over how to split his share of the loot. But it's like, how do you communicate some of the things that you want people to know? And in Descent into Avernus, a lot of the times they just somebody fucking tells you. Because it's diabolical power struggles and shit. How do you communicate that to players? And you sort of can't, so they just fucking give it to you. Which was a shame, I thought, because there's a lot of potential, especially in the early parts of the game, for delving into mysteries and doing investigations. You're trying to find ostensibly supernatural serial killers at the beginning of the book, right? And that I find that fucking fascinating. I'd do a whole campaign just around somebody who hunts supernatural serial killers. In fact, I've been planning something like that for a long time, and I was just like, ooh, that's beautiful. That's fucking sweet. But it's
it's funny you should mention that, because I have a campaign that I've sort of been designing in lieu of the Persona games made by Atlas, where there's these characters who, they have their everyday normal lives in the real world, but then there's sort of this alternate shadow realm where things are happening and it's influencing the real world. All this stuff about Jungian psychology, really fascinating stuff. Mm-hmm. The plot of that one, I was going to have, a serial killer who is using the shadow world to, kill people in the real world. I will have to talk with you more in detail about that later.
Yeah, stuff like that's fun. But in a module, as opposed to this, where I'm like, okay, I'll lay some of these clues. The characters have got these people they're connected to in the world. Particularly the lawyer I talked about. Lawyer worships devils, so the Temple of the Devils is involved. And boy, is that a fast track into leaking information about what's going on in Avernus, right? It would be. But in a module, it might even be inappropriate to do that, because if a module is something that's got to be short, then you're going to want to do what they did in Descent into Avernus, where somebody bribes you with being their bodyguard and then gives you the information that solves the puzzle for you. Because if you don't, and they are supposed to go through all of this rigmarole, then who knows how long that might take, who knows what roads they might go down. It's going to take time away from the module. It's going to take space in the module just to talk about the people in the world who have the answers to the questions, right? The information has to be delivered in the right way, and the players have to know what is expected of them as far as what's happening in the world and what their choices to deal with it are. And there's very different modes of delivery for that, depending on how much time you have to explain it, or how deep the story's going to be. If you add something for yourself, for example, that you think is going to be interesting, or that ties into the backstories of the characters for some reason, like maybe you're going to run Cult of the Reptile God, but one of your players is a lizard man, then you might have some fodder to work with there. But whatever it is that you add, you have to get in, say it, and get out, as I said before. Whereas with Descent into Avernus, I've been fucking around for ages on all kinds of stuff. And the players have barely scratched the surface on a lot of it because of the way that they wound up going about it. But it's still part of the world. And we have time for that, sort of. I mean, they were trapped in the same dungeon for like 2 months because we couldn't get together. But that's not the same thing. That's not the book's fault or my fault. That's the fault of scheduling.
I feel like just the length of modules themselves, because they are so short, because very small amount let you decide to stretch it out, which is one of the reasons DM might use milestone leveling instead of experience leveling.
Mm-hmm.
But like it's because it's such a short experience, very hard to put mystery campaign unless it's like one big mystery that the entirety of that module is running around, like focusing on that one mystery, trying to solve it. That gives you a good long time to sink your teeth into that mystery. But aside from that, if you want to do something smaller scale, you have to do that really, really quick.
There's a way to do both of those things too, but that's going to depend on who you're playing with. So if you're writing a module and you don't know who you're writing it for, there's no real way to deal with that situation. But I could see a Call of Cthulhu inspired mystery type thing going on where you've got between 1 and 3 levels, depending on how it's played, where people are doing just, hard investigation, and there might not even be that much combat, and when there is, it's like extremely simplistic combat except for a final encounter that's overwhelming and just hilariously one-sided against the players on principle.
That's just the mood and feel of Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah, which would be awesome. But at the same time, it's like, again, the Dungeon Master's going to have to know what they're getting into, and they're going to need to be able to communicate with the tools that you give them as quickly as possible what the players are going to be dealing with. Call of Cthulhu is a fucking awesome story, and it could be the great campaign for the right sort of people. Most of the people I play Dungeons & Dragons with in Nostria, in our West Marches server on Discord, they are not going to play that kind of game, and they're not going to have a good time. Even people who are fans of Lovecraft probably wouldn't necessarily enjoy that as a game. Because most of what happens in there is just nothing until at the very end there is an unsurmountable foe and your task is to get out alive. That's not how most people play D&D.
A lot of people play D&D, I see, as like a power fantasy. And, that's an okay way to play D&D. Call of Cthulhu, totally valid way to play D&D. But, yeah, again, the players need to be aware going into it of exactly what they're getting into. And every group is going to be different as to what they enjoy playing. Again, Skulls and Shackles, if you're not willing to play pirates, that's not that's not an adventure path you want to get into. Because if you're not playing pirates, story, and all the conflicts and stuff, a lot of them aren't going to make very much sense for a group of not pirates.
Yeah. So you want to set up a structure that the Dungeon Master can use quickly and easily. If you're writing something that's very, very long, then it's really more like a world that you're giving to the Dungeon Master. And that's a lot more flexible.
That starts becoming more of a campaign setting, something along the lines of like the Sword Coast Adventures, Eberron, stuff like that.
Even
and,
just Baldar's Gate as a location in general.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Waterdeep.
Yes, Waterdeep. The thing about that is, it's weird, in a certain manner of speaking, the larger the project you're working on, the easier it is to write. But when you're talking about something that's supposed to be modular and it's supposed to be fairly short and it's something that people are supposed to be able to put into another overall experience, it's surprisingly difficult to write that despite the fact that it's very short. Because of how much work you have to do, how concise it has to be, how much you have to be able to communicate. And you have to give the dungeon master the structure that's gonna work here. And you have to communicate that structure to them, and you have to give them the tools to communicate it to the players. It's funny how radically different that is. Because what I was trying to do before, I'm just talking about how all this stuff goes on in my campaign setting of Ravenant, and if you're not familiar with it, that's fine. We'll do this instead, and you'll pick it up along the way. There's a section in there where it's like, you want people to feel like they're bored at sea for a while. And how do you make the players feel like they're bored at sea for a while without the players themselves being bored in the game? And then how am I going to, if this isn't going to be this huge thing where I've got all this stuff going on and I'm building this whole plot around Mordheim Ansler and this, Ziggurat of Terror and this whole voyage out to sea and this weird alien situation where there's no reprieve of normalcy. If I'm going to go through that whole process, there's a lot of things that I can just leave the dungeon master and the players to work out on their own. But if I'm going to write this module so that they just get on a boat, have this adventure at the island, then get back on the boat, that's completely different. And I have to come up with a way that I'm going to be like, at this point, they need to be bored at sea for a while. At this point, the revelation is made about what these characters are and how they work. Spoilers, the mutiny happens, all that kind of stuff goes on. Then that becomes what it's about, and I have to be able to boil that down in a way where I can say to the Dungeon Master, this is what it is that happens, this is how you communicate it, and then there needs to be a structure for an adventure that the Dungeon Master is able to just follow, which is not the case at all in something like Storm King's Thunder. Because in Storm King's Thunder, there's a whole world where people can just screw around. There's this huge video that Cody did for Taking 20 about how the whole party was just doing stuff with their backgrounds and they're totally way off the book, which is something you can do in that kind of adventure, right? There's a whole world in which these things can take place in. You're not going to get that in Against the Reptile. There's a town and a boathouse.
I mean, I do think that the number of locations can affect the structure of your campaign. Obviously, the bigger your campaign gets, the more space you're probably going to want to cover with it, because that gives you more variety in what kinds of enemies they face, kind of challenges that they encounter.
Yeah.
This isn't always the case. For again, if I go back to Curse of Strahd, there is one region, the region of Barovia, in which there is also a town called Barovia, and in that scenario, you just have this one small area where everything happens from roughly level 1 all the way up to potentially level 30.
Yeah.
Look at that, Curse of Strahd right on the cover.
I've actually been thinking that I might run a 5th edition Curse of Strahd in order to learn Fantasy Grounds. I want to run my system, but I got a bunch of materials that are specifically for 5th edition. I might do Phandelver instead. I don't know. But I've been keeping myself from being spoiled on Curse of Strahd since 1999. And I've never actually played it. And I'm probably...
So what you're telling me is at some point in the future, I gotta get you and a bunch of other people willing to do so to play Curse of Strahd.
Well, maybe, but I might just run it. That might be what I do for the Fantasy Ground show I've been talking about. Before we move on to the next section, though, you have a note here to talk about the Whistling Tree. What is that?
Oh, okay. So, something folks in chat may or may not be aware of. There is an entire community making Pokemon tabletop games.
I regret everything. Yeah.
You laugh, but so they've got 3 different systems, and there does not exist a whole lot of good introductory module stuff, but there does exist one, and the players and the members of the community keep pointing back. It is Elemental Knights, the Whistling Tree, and I think it is a fantastic example of everything that you need to have in a module. Elemental Knight, some folks might actually know the guy who's currently in the process of creating Reclaim the Wild, which is a Legend of Zelda tabletop game. Also really good, so shout out to him. But the Whistling Tree is, first of all, like, the tree itself is the centerpiece of the whole adventure, right? And it's this scenario where there's poachers and they're basically causing chaos for everyone. So it's a very small region within this forest. You have Kariko Village. Central Village has got the people there who are, trying to keep themselves inside the village because the bugs have been going crazy because their numbers are getting reduced and being captured and attacked constantly by the poachers. They're just sort of lashing out angrily at all of the humans who live there. So you create, there's leader of the poachers who are like ex-rocket thugs, Crane, and so there's one character. You have Fern, who is supposedly the gym leader of the town, specializes in grass types. Why the situation is dire, because the powerful trainer there is weak to the things they're getting attacked by, which is one of the reasons why she needs to stay at town, and why the players are the ones who get to go out and adventure. And there's all these, these sorts of areas. I've actually been talking with Kay himself, planning to revamp that and bring it in a bit more of a modern era. The module was created many editions ago of Pokemon Tabletop Adventures. It's not really current, but I'm just saying, like, there's a lot of those cool things within that module. I just thought it was... now I'm done gushing now. You can move on to the next point.
I wish that I had just let that one slide. All right, so you got lists of pros and cons now. You want to talk us through that?
Yeah, so there are different strengths of running a module or an adventure path as opposed to, say, creating your own campaign. So, on the upside, like, if you're running a module or adventure path, one of the great things is that there's a ton of work that's already done. We're talking, like, stat blocks, enemies to encounter, what NPCs are notable. They often give you maps. This is especially important if it's, like, dungeon delving adventure, because making dungeon maps, specific maps, traps, monsters, certain obstacles for players to get around, that can be really difficult sometimes in real life. A lot of times I've seen players draw up sort of quickie battle maps on grid paper for people to run on. I've certainly done it a time myself. So, like, all of those materials are immediately available ready. On top of that, it gives your dungeon master structure. So, if you're a new dungeon master and you don't really understand module, great, because tell you this is what this world is like and give you an idea as to what a looks like without having struggle your way trying to figure it out yourself through watching players destroy everything you worked so hard to build.
They will.
Because
they will.
To build, they absolutely will. Always expect your players to go as far off the rails as possible.
They will destroy all of your hopes and dreams with want and abandon.
Don't get me wrong, I love my players, but dang it, guys, you cut it out.
I love it. I love it. Because you don't. The thing that's best about Dungeons and Dragons is the surprise when the players come up with something and you're like, you're gonna what? I mean, sure, roll the dice, throw the fucking bones.
Okay, so I have this great example of a moment when a player went completely off the rails and destroyed everything. So I had this plan, and it was going to be this boss fight in like this factory type place, on a railway above these vats of acid, right? And it was going to be this really, really cool climactic fight where the players have to struggle to not be thrown into the acid below. So one of my players had earlier gotten himself in trouble by developing a reputation as a thief by stealing from people like in the dead of night, and he got caught. So because he has a reputation as a thief, like, people know that he's up to good. So this villainous guy is, starts doing his monologue, and the player, like, grabs one of his party members to take them hostage. He's like, hey, I got them this far, and now they're all yours. Come work for me, or can I work for you now? The guy's like, you know what? Yeah, absolutely you can. That'd be great. So the player says, let's shake on it. And in real life, he offers his hand. So I reach over to take it. As soon as I, start shaking his hand, he grabs my hand as hard as he can and says, I initiate a grapple. One dunk in the acid later, I am short a boss fight.
I think that maybe I just learned a long time ago to just live with it. But I'm having a hard time thinking of anything that happened where I was totally unprepared. Like, there were times that the players have done things where I was like, wow, that was crazy. But it's never been something where it was like, wow, now I have serious problems for my campaign because I don't know what to do after they've done this.
Well, to be completely fair, I got revenge on that player later on. Or perhaps I should say, one of the folks in chat got revenge on that player. He was the DM for that Skull's Shackle campaign we ran.
Mm-hmm. And then, yes, Miriam stole the death knell.
Yes, she stole the death knell, which is like the enchanted bell of a ghost ship, and like, how do you respond to that? What are you supposed to do with the players?
It is interesting, I think, talking about limited to enemies in the Monster Manual Player's Handbook and enemies unique to the campaign. That can be important because if something is not in the SRD, you're not supposed to put it in stuff that you put on the DM's Guild. You're allowing access to something that people are supposed to have to pay to access. So that can be a problem for Wizards of the Coast. Whereas something that's, unique to your module might be neat, and it's probably a nice experience for people who are a bit jaded otherwise because they've seen it all. But it also means that there's a lot of resources you can't really have access to, that you can't really use. Like the Cave Fisher is in Volo's Guide, and the Cave Fisher has a pedigree in Dungeons & Dragons that runs back a long way. So not having access to something like that in these adventures is, that's kind of like... But if you put that in there, I mean, you probably could. You could make an adventure module that used all kinds of shit you're not supposed to put in there. You just don't charge any money for it. Which is something you can do too. In fact, I might even suggest doing something like that. Because if you find a niche like that, fill it up, throw something out there for free, it gets your name out there, and then they're going to see the stuff that you've done that you want to get paid for.
I mean, that's something that I'm going to have to do with one of the campaigns that I'm on. Rise of Mad Gengar. The entire thing is based on Ancient King and like the magic technology aspects that are found in Eberron, and a lot of the enemies that are involved are constant.
Yeah.
And as a result, I have to work with Monster Manual. Even if I expand into Eberron, I just don't have enough stuff. I've got to create in order to make that happen. And that's one of the downsides if you are creating a module. You can pull things from that one book. Two books, because there's technically some, but you can only pull from those core 3 books all of the content. If you want to spread out, you can't do a module. For example, we'll just go back to Curse of Fraud, because I keep that, there is, typical anime armor that you find in handbook, but there's other enemies there, characters. For example, Tree Blight. You wouldn't think Tree Blight is a very specific enemy. Rod's animated armor, the classic, the Broom of Animated Attack, Guardian Portrait. There are these things that are these great monsters, and often tropes you might expect in other adventures, but all of these things draw. Mm-hmm. And some of these things probably should be drawn. For example, Strahd himself, entire stat block should belong to Strahd, but it means that any of these other characters, any of these other monsters or other things, are completely unique to the book. Can't be used anywhere else unless you expect players to go out and buy an additional book to throw on top of the stuff you did.
Yeah.
If you're running a campaign of your own at home, like making a campaign, you don't have those limitations. Dungeon Master. Whatever stuff you want at the players without ever having to worry about anyone having access to the book, because who's ever going to see your adventure? You're going to need access. The other point that I have in there, if there is a module and a player who played it before, you mentioned yourself that Cursed Strahd have been holding all out for at least 1999, you said?
Yeah.
And, if someone has played Cursed Strahd before, and then goes to the module knowing all of that information,
suddenly becomes exponentially harder for them to not metagame, to not skip parts of the plot, to make crazy leaps of logic characters otherwise would be able to make, because they've already gone through the adventure.
For sure.
And if you're creating your own campaign, you don't have that problem, because again, nobody could have read it, nobody has access to it but you. They can't do that metagaming. And let me be clear that metagaming is not always a bad thing.
Well, sure.
But I mean, in this circumstance, like, your character knowing they should know and skipping over what might be otherwise developmental parts of the campaign the other players played it.
It can potentially lead to one of the players ruining the experience for the other players.
Yes.
And that's an issue. But that is also sort of two-sided. Right? Because there's a good that can come along with that. Except that good you can also get if you did write it for yourself. Because like, for example, Thud in the Dungeon or Thud in the Basement. I might do a Thud in the Basement with a completely different group of people and see how that experience is different. I've experienced it before, so I'm really familiar with the events that take place, much more so than anything else I've done, because everything else I've ever done as a Dungeon Master, I've only ever done once, with the exception of the adventure we talked about going by sea. But the last time I did that was in 3.5. We never finished it. There were 7 players. The second time I did it, there were 3 players. We did it in 2 days.
I mean, also in that case, like, you're a Dungeon Master who knows the character.
Yes.
Players has run it multiple times before. Could be very different. Say some Joe Schmo Dungeon Master has now picked up Thud in the Base.
Yeah.
He doesn't know who Thud is. He doesn't know that character. He doesn't know about his post skills, tendency, or straight line at whatever happens to be a problem.
Yeah.
And players aren't going to have that expectation going in either.
Yeah. And if I, again, that's something that has to be explained right away, as quickly and easy to understand as possible. So, Thud in the Basement would probably start out with, this is Thud, this is what he's like, this is what happened to him. The adventurer's job is to save Thud from the basement. And then go through chronological order after that's done. Whereas in an adventure, the size of Descent into Avernus or Curse of Strahd nowadays, then I might play that radically differently. And I might not even care. Do I care that they don't know how Thud would normally work? Does that matter? And that's another question for modular play, too. If you're taking something that was an experience that was intimate to you and a group of people, and now you're going to give it to a bunch of strangers. You got to figure out what it is that's important and what's not. But I think that when we're talking about, because the idea, I'm fascinated by the idea of doing it, Descent into Avernus again. Because I told you, I made up half of the people that are in it based on the backstories of the people who were going to play it. Well, if I did a completely different group, that small army of NPCs would be completely different too. And we're talking like the same book could be used to have an incomparably different experience. And Descent into Avernus is huge. It goes on forever and ever and ever. So that could be really interesting, too. That could be very exciting to see how that might be different. That's not something... most of the adventures that I run are not something that you could repeat, really. You could do something where it was in a similar spirit, but it's not like I have what happened written down. I mean, even in Nostria, where we literally do that as part of how the game is played, there's not necessarily that much detail about each of the things that took place and how they did it as compared to a book like Descent into Avernus or Curse of Strahd, or even any of the small modules.
Well, I do think that's something that should take into account when modules that you have as a dungeon master to expand upon these worlds.
Yeah.
Change how things work. Like, for example, that level gap I mentioned in Curse of Strahd, where there's this problem where you're like level 8, but you've already done everything leading up to Strahd's cast.
Yeah.
So at that point, you can start inserting stuff that give your players enough experience that they can become strong enough to actually go and face Strahd at a decent level, especially if they haven't had the opportunity to necessarily collect all of the things. I'm trying really hard not to spoil things.
Yeah. So,
but, I mean,
speaking of which,
it's a good campaign. It's one of the few adventure paths I've played all the way through, so I know a lot about it.
Being able to repeat the experience with different players
is something that should also be on the table when you're talking about modules, because you might get more use out of a module than just the immediate use that you have for it.
And also, talking about what you were saying, there's also like Hannet. People use the town of Hannet as a base after they've done something like Return to Temple of Elemental Evil or whatever. They'll keep going back to that town, and that town will become the base of the adventure that's happening in the custom campaign world that the Dungeon Master is putting the players through long after they've run that campaign that they started the game with. And that town comes from that book. And that's, I mean, it's going to be a very different town by the time they're done with it, I'm sure. But that's something that you can stop to think about, too. Sometimes some of the groundwork that's in these little pamphlet adventures can very massively inform the way that a Dungeon Master or a group plays after that. And one of the things that I like about Descent into Avernus is I'm doing Descent into Avernus in my own campaign setting. So I've altered it heavily for that purpose, which means that the other half of the book, which is the Gazetteer of Baldar's Gate and a lot of other stuff that's in there, that could be a completely different adventure for a completely different time if I ever want to run something specifically in the actual Baldar's Gate. Using those NPCs, using that world, using that town. I got a 2-for-1 out of that book, right? Because I've got this whole other thing that might happen. This whole other possibility. And I'm not even using any of it right now.
Those are like at least the big major pros and cons that I've thought of about using an adventure module, adventure path, as opposed to writing your own campaign. Any additional thoughts to that?
No, I think we're ready to move on.
Okay. Well, then, in that case, the next section that we've written up in our notes here is sort of things to watch out for when creating an adventure module or creating even a campaign. We already talked about, the importance of having class and like making sure that one isn't too powerful or kind of useless. Like Ranger is really good at survival campaign, but it's kind of useless. The entire thing takes place in the urban center.
Arguably, they're not as useful as they should be in 5th edition at all.
Yeah, Rangers are a problem. I think we all acknowledge 5th edition Ranger pretty weak. Even the Ranger revised still relatively lame compared to all of the other classes. Yeah. I'm sorry, but clerics are pretty much king. But one thing that I think is worth considering is sequence breaking. Specifically, modules will have points at which it's technically possible to access areas that might be higher level than your players can fully handle, which can either result in the party getting killed off quickly, or it can result in them managing to overcome a challenge that they had no right overcoming. Curse of Strahd, we had a sequence break where we were up against enemies that we had no business surviving against, and we just got really lucky and overcame them. And that can happen sometimes. So it's a question, how do you handle that? Do things themselves back in balance, or things go wildly chaotic now that you have lost that? Like, how locked in is it?
Yeah.
Because if you're locked in, you don't have that flexibility to say, okay, well, now we can bring this in so that players can actually feel a challenge. Or maybe it's okay to let the players not feel all that challenged at the level, because the experience they're going to get from lower level adventure packs not stronger.
Yeah, and that's also another thing where it depends heavily on the length of the adventure. Right, because if you're talking about a full-on adventure path, there's all sorts of wacky shit that could possibly or potentially go on.
Absolutely.
The Gazetteer of Baldar's Gate, for example, you could fuck right off of the whole adventure and just wind up in the political struggles in that town and overthrow one of the dukes. And that's definitely on the table, and that would definitely be something that your characters aren't supposed to have the power to accomplish on their own. But there are pieces in play, and there are movers and shakers, and who knows what might happen. That's something that you might need to look into, because if the players suddenly decide that they have a horse in the race at last of Eltriel going to hell, then they have the backing of one of the fucking dukes. Then a lot of stuff with like the Black Three is going to be a pushover because they've got an army or whatever it is,
Yeah, there's even stuff like on a simple level, like let's say that there's wall that separates players between, let's say, the first and the last. And like normally that would be fine, because like players wouldn't know that there's space wall there, or like they have to go around a long ways to essentially go back to a straight line what got them, like that. Wouldn't have been a problem, because it's a wall. It blocks the blocking and getting another. But if players have tools or they somehow have knowledge of, oh, you get to the other side, they could surprise you bring out that you might not expect it. So, for example, let's got a divination wizard with access to blink and clairvoyance. So somehow rise on the area on the other side and then cast blink because now she knows where she's teleporting and skips the entire area.
Mm-hmm.
Or a dimension door, you can bring allies with if your campaign is that high level. So even
something
little things like that.
Yeah, even something as simple as the druid wild shaping into a spider and running through to scout the whole place before the party goes in.
I mean, yeah, like, be aware that your stuff is going to get sequence broken. It's going to be scouted out. Some players will be power gamers and will have, like, set ideas of how they enter dungeons. I'm not saying that you build your module specifically to counter those types of players, because, like, that type of playstyle is valid, and if you want to write modules for those types of players, you're welcome to. Again, make sure everyone is aware going into it. I think we'll keep on harping on that.
Yeah, vice versa, also true. Don't put the players and or Dungeon Master in a situation where their game cannot progress because of something that did or didn't go on. The most notorious one is locking progress behind a skill that the players don't have access to. But we've already gone over that kind of thing. But there could also be something like, literally the only way that they could possibly find an important piece of information is an NPC that's now dead. That's a notorious one as well. So you want to have, maybe not fail-safes, but be aware as a writer that you don't want to set something up where that's likely, and be aware as a dungeon master that something like that might be possible. Like, a lot of people who play these games are psychopaths, apparently. One of the most popular things that I have ever done in my whole life was I shared a meme once, and it was the Puzzle of Sir Mix-a-Lot, which was a variation of I Can Only Tell the Truth, My Brother Only Lies, or whatever it is. It was a funny joke and everything, but half of the people responding to it on the internet was like, you know, I cut one's throat with my sword, and I shit down the other one's mouth until he chokes and dies. Ha ha, have I solved your riddle, Dungeon Master? And I'm like, no. No, you killed both of them, and now no one can tell you the answer. Also, you're probably under arrest, because you're a murderer. What is happening here?
I mean, it's technically still possible for them to solve the puzzle. All they have to do is walk down one corridor or the other, and if they die, well,
yeah, exactly.
You know, there you go, puzzle solved. I died.
I would consider it a solution for sure. But like, it's one of those things. If both of those NPCs died, that puzzle is now basically insurmountable unless you come up with a way around it. And apparently, players are prone to thinking that way, so be prepared. Class importance, we were talking about too, and we did touch on that early on. But something else that you might think about too is like, what are classes really? I hate classes. I'm notorious for this. I'm a huge asshole about it. Because I think that class basically in Dungeons & Dragons communities means stereotype. And you're supposed to exist within a stereotype, and if you do something that's unusual or interesting as a character, then either that's the point, but to a point, or you're a pariah because you're not following the rules the way other people think you should. And I just sort of hate that kind of thing. So if you're thinking to yourself as you're writing this module in terms of this is what a cleric does, this is what a bard does, this is what a barbarian does, and your story is going to have complications because the bard's not trying to have sex with somebody they shouldn't, which of course is their stereotype, or there's a barbarian in your module who is an idiot who can't read, or something like that. Like, maybe deal with that to some extent, and don't assume that players are going to come in with holier-than-thou paladins. That's not even a real thing anymore. That hasn't even been a rule since 3rd edition.
I mean, I do still have a player who plays a holier-than-thou paladin,
well,
but that's
so do
because
I.
the player plays a holier-than-thou paladin rather than because paladin is supposed to be holier-than-thou.
Yeah, so I'm not going to write a module where I expect it. And I'm not going to write a module. I might write a module where I have a character that does that, but it would probably be tongue-in-cheek, like that would be satirical. To have the paladin that's an asshole and nobody wants to work with him, so the paladin always has to work alone except for the people that they literally pay to follow them around.
Honestly, breaking of those stereotypes, very interesting characters.
Yeah,
or even just like taking those stereotypes and then pushing them up to 11 can create really interesting characters. For example, yeah, sure, there's this bard who sleeps around a lot. Well, how does that affect the world? Suddenly there's a lot of half-breed kids running around trying to look for their estranged father. You know, you have like an army that starts.
Yeah, you have a subplot where it turns out that they're actually on the run because they don't want to be on the hook for their illegitimate kids. You know, like, use it. But don't require it of players in the way that you write, obviously. When we're talking about NPCs that are going to fill holes, be very cognizant of who those NPCs are and how they work. Because there's been this problem for a long time in Dungeons & Dragons. It's like, oh yes, the powerful wizard is the one who's giving you the mission. Why wouldn't the powerful wizard just do it if they're powerful wizard? They're powerful now. And the answer is because they need something for the players to do. And if that becomes naked, it can be a real problem for a lot of gamers. There's a section...
situations like that. Skulls and Shackles. The players, are shanghaied onto this ship, and they're not immediately given big importance, because they're just some newbie scrubs who they picked up. And, while you do eventually, spoilers, mutiny, take over the ship and become, more important on the ship. Initially, early on, you're just a couple of scrubs who are forced to do chores around the ship. You're not important yet, so later on in the adventure, and people can actually expect things that you've done because they've seen you do incredible things at that point.
An example of one of those characters is the Archmage Traxagor in Descendant to Avernus. The Archmage is outrageously powerful. So what the writers did is they just had him fuck off for no reason. In order to solve there's an NPC that's too powerful thing. I was like, you didn't even try. There's even like some really easy stuff you could do right there in order to use that character, which I intend to do when the time comes. But I'm not going to have him just fuck right off. That's bullshit. And fuck you for doing it. What? Why? What an asshole.
I mean, why would you introduce such a powerful, important character? Gonna write him out. I mean, in that case, may as well use like Tavern Dweller number 35.
Yeah, God, I made this.
Make NPCs supposed to be important actually important.
Yeah.
Don't make unimportant suddenly important, unless party happens to fixate on them because you did a funny voice.
Well, I mean, that's a little different too. I mean, you could write instructions for funny voices in a module, I suppose.
Oh yeah.
But usually, it's Chekhov's gun. If you're not going to use them, don't put them in there. Especially in a module, because you don't have time for that shit. Why are you wasting your time talking about an NPC you're not going to use? Have the powerful NPC turn out to be the villain in the end. That's you're firing Chekhov's gun at that point. That works. But otherwise, if you're not using them, don't put them in there. Because you're wasting valuable pages. The way to do that is to write adventures, is to write modules, right? I think you should write a module, and then you should write maybe a follow-up module, and then maybe a follow-up module. Now you've got a super module. Put that in there separately as its own thing. And then start that process again. And when you have like 4 super modules, now you've got an adventure path. And if you've got an adventure path, that's the beginning of a campaign setting. So it sort of takes care of itself as you move forward. It's just like writing a book in academia, You do a journal article, then you do a journal article, then you do a journal article. Next thing you know, you've got all the chapters laid out for your book already.
I mean, it's the same thing in pretty much any writing style. We can take a bunch of small bits and pieces, eventually bring them together as we work on it, full-on story. I mean, we write fiction novels like 1 chapter at a time, right? That's essentially a collection of smaller books.
Is there anything else we need to talk about before we start wrapping up?
Last things I think players need to watch out for is level scaling. I mentioned that I like milestones early on because it allows you to pace. But if you're writing an adventure module and or writing it for just about any player who wants to pick play, absolutely have to watch out. That makes sure players have enough experience to get up to the next level, that they were powerful enough to face the challenge.
Yeah.
I find that what 5th edition does, balance it for a group of a player-sized party of like 4 players of varying class. You can add or subtract additional enemies or make targets make creatures stronger or weaker depending on facing accordingly. But make sure that you're paying attention to how powerful players are becoming. And one last thing I wanted to talk about. Mentioned it earlier, magical items can have a impact on a module and on an adventure path and campaign, depending on how they... Let's say you have a bag of holding. That right there, very common magical item. A lot of players, because they like to not worry about...
Yeah, it's convenient.
It's convenient. But I've also seen Bag of Holding creative, potentially campaign drawing ways.
Yep.
Like, for example, let's say that you want to capture a guy and keep him around and carry him around with you, but you don't want him to be obvious to the guards as you're walking by. Well, wrap him up, shove him in the Bag of Holdings, carry him into the town, and interrogate him later in a secure facility. Stuff like that.
You gotta move quick because there's no air in there. But
Yeah,
that is something that we might discuss for a moment too, though, is make sure that what you do is as appropriate as possible. 5th edition is deliberately very magic item light, especially when it comes to things that influence bounded accuracy. So you want to watch magic weapons and armor especially. And it was always a huge problem back in the old days to have somebody from one table or group come up to another table or group, especially at conventions, with equipment that was radically inappropriate for their level or even just for the adventure. You don't want to put, your +2 Holy Avenger in one of these modules. So what I like to do is, especially if I'm doing 5th edition, is to make something interesting and fun for people, but not something that affects the math of the game in any real direct way. Like, one of my favorite things is the ever-pouring jug, which, again, can destroy...
Yes, that's a great item, but, like...
Yeah, it can destroy
imagine that in my death campaign.
Yeah.
Imagine what that would like. Got an ever-pouring jug of liquid. You are set for life. I mean, obviously, you still have to deal with Moswin and Abraxas and him coming after you for that jug, because if he controls that jug, he still controls the water.
Yes, but then, like Bag of Magic Beans, that's another great example. Miriam's talking about her bag of magic beans, and it's definitely something where you can have a good time, and it makes things complicated. It's weird, random, it's exciting, but it doesn't wreck the game like a +2 magic sword is going to wreck a game. Even though a +2 magic sword is a perfectly ordinary thing in most games of Dungeons & Dragons, the way that 5th edition is designed, it could be a serious issue. So you don't want somebody coming out of a module with equipment that's inappropriate. And a Bag of Holding is extremely convenient, but you're probably going to want to avoid that unless you're deliberately writing a mid or high level campaign, in which case it might not even be that useful because it's quite likely players would already have one, right? But it can destroy low level play to have something like a Bag of Holding.
One other thing that I think is cool to talk about and consider is the way that magical items specifically for campaign, like if you want to do this story where there's a magical ring that allows you to turn invisible, and it's a problem because it, causes horrible death and destruction being used by a phylactery for a lich, and it needs to be thrown in a volcano. Yes, I know.
Just at random. Just at
random. Not some random media platform. I'm not making a media reference. No, of course not.
Yeah.
But if that happens to be a case, like that magical item should be very important to your campaign. Because your story, your plot is revolving around this magical item. And I think a lot of times it's great to use those magic items. If you're going to do so, I suggest using it in larger stories, in adventure paths, campaigns. Modules themselves don't really have a lot of space to be able to use those magic items in smaller capacity. Never count on magic item, powerful ones, being plot important. Small modules. Save them for the adventure path.
Or even put them in the module, but have the point of the module involve destroying them. Or make them somehow only useful in that module. Like a rod, the bearer of the rod is under the effects of endure elements at all times. So they're just comfortable in basic weather conditions, as long as they're not weather so adverse that it causes damage or threatens life or whatever. That's kind of nice. It's not terribly important. But it is what controls the storm at the Tomb of Bahidi that allows the players to come and go. So now it's pivotal and important and amazingly powerful in the module. But outside of the module, it's still interesting. And it has value to the player and sentimental value to the group, but it doesn't destroy other games. It's still limited in its power to the module.
Yeah, things of that nature. That's, I think, the right way to magic items. Folks are mentioning, like, set it to fulfill any purpose. Anytime you have something like that, that's not the kind of magic item that you want or plot availability. You got your magic item, well, then you get deal like, maybe have these raids specifically chase people who are carrying the ring around, that are big and terrifying and scary. So, an important part of the plot is being able to avoid those. And you can't do it by putting on the ring and find other ways around it. Stealth, traps, allies, things of that nature. Traps and allies, stuff of that nature. So that there are ways to work around whatever magical items. Balance your modules and campaigns around the magical items intending to put in them.
All right.
I think my int quality is dropping, but I mean that's pretty typical. What I'm saying is, if you're putting a powerful magic item that can drastically affect the game, make the game itself balanced around the item.
Yes, that also has to be limited to when it's appropriate to be using items like that.
Yeah.
So, is there anything else we want to talk about before we call it a night?
I think that covers everything I want to talk about.
I don't suppose we have questions or anything, do we?
Any questions in the chat?
Yeah, we need, it also takes a while for them to see us, and then it takes us a while to see their responses, too. So, we'll wait for them to come up with something for us. In the meantime, I'll say that there's a bunch of stuff on the, on D&D Beyond that I've done, too, that's homebrew stuff, for 5th edition, which people might look at, especially if they're playing the 5th edition game, that takes place in that, more or less in that campaign setting that, Zach is running. Sections do you need for modules? Sections. Okay, that's actually a better question than it should be, because the answer to the question should be basically sort of one. Because you should be able to explain what is happening in a module by saying in chronological events what you more or less expect to have happen. But that can't actually be the answer, because as we've been talking about, you have to get right up front what the adventure is about into the Dungeon Master's hands and mind immediately, and then arm the Dungeon Master to put that information into the player's heads immediately. And so if you're doing that, then you're probably also going to have some kind of information about what's happening immediately in the setting. That's 3 already. That's 3. That's like the villain and or problem. That's the how you're going to have the Dungeon Master explain that, which is probably some kind of exposition, and then the wizard in the tavern that gives them the quest or whatever it is. And then the third is going to be the town that tavern is in, or the city of Hanet, or the town of Orlais, or explaining to somebody you just got off a boat in a jungle, good luck, motherfucker. Or you're on a boat, motherfucker, don't you ever forget, etc., etc. And that's already 3 sections, and we haven't even got into the adventure yet. Right? So that's probably about 4 sections, right? It's probably about 4 sections.
Well, on top of the adventure itself, to have this section at the end, that's like a mini monster manual.
Yeah.
So if you're running along the path, that thing that you probably...
It's a good idea to have something like that in a module anyway. Monsters are either something that are available through SRD, core rulebooks, or they're unique to the adventure itself, because you can't have anything else in these adventures, because there's no guarantee that somebody has a supplement guide, and you probably can't sell it if you're using something that's out of a supplement guide anyway, because it's a violation of the terms of the DM's Guild, right? So it could be a good idea to have a miniature monster manual at the end if you have characters that are unique to the module. In fact, you have to have it if you have characters unique to the module. I suppose you could have them peppered without, then not have something toward the end. That's probably not the way to handle it. You probably should do it in that way. And again, if you just write a module and then a module and then a module and then a module and then put them together into a larger project, then you have already done something with those sections, and then each of those is divided into a section, right? So your chapter of your adventure path is the module you've already done.
So like add that same thing, monster, do it with any magical item.
Yeah.
Like you have your magic swords, your magic rings, whatever, that have effects, aren't like pull up in the Dungeon Master Guide.
It's a good point, and they do that, by the way. If you check a lot of this stuff, they do that. The Descent into Avernus has got the magic items and the monsters at the end in their own little thing, and the Gazetteer of Baldur's Gate is back there too. So you've got all of this additional stuff about what's happening in the rest of this product. And if you make a module and then another module and another module, you're going to want to put all of the stuff from each of those modules, just like we're talking about, at the end of the collection as well. And so you will wind up with stuff like that where you have these glossaries.
Honestly, like a table of contents is really good to have too. Just like, here are the pages that all of my stuff is on. But that's specifically if you've got much longer thing.
Yeah.
Like, if it's just 10 pages for a module, you're probably not going to need a table of content.
Yeah.
People are going to scroll down and know exactly where that is.
There's
But if you're running an adventure path...
There's also something to be said about NPCs as well. Like, you might put a section which has the NPCs that are important in there, just like the Gazetteer I was talking about. That might not be necessary, because there might only be 1 or 2 important NPCs in the whole thing. Back in the old days, they used to put the possessions and levels of each of the NPCs in there, just in case the players needed to kill everybody in the town of Orlais for no good reason. Because murder hobos, etc. But, or thieves needed to be able to steal from all of them, so it says where all of the gold is hidden in all of the places so that the thief had something to do. Because otherwise, why are you playing a thief?
Here's something else that I think is mentioning. So in some setting, you might use unique mechanic campaign setting.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to Curse of Strahd again, sorry. But the first part of the book details this information about fortune telling, which is used by one of the characters. More importantly, used by the DM to determine the location of something important.
Yeah.
And, like, the entire first part of the book is dedicated to, first of all, talking about Throd, who he is, what his story is, and how to deal with playing him, because he is such an important key character to the entire story as the main villain. But on top of that, you know, there's an entire section about this is how the fortune telling, this is how to do it, here's how to end players, the way it functions.
Yeah.
And if your campaign or adventure path or whatever has anything like that, that needs to be straight up front, easy to access, easy to find. Either that or, like, at the end of the book. Like, it needs to be on one of the bookends so that the GM can access it very quickly.
Like we were talking about doing Call of Cthulhu as a homebrewed module, then you're probably going to want to involve some kind of insanity mechanic, which might be unique to that adventure. In the Tomb of Bahidi, we might need to talk about water, and there might need to be mechanics for getting your hands on water.
And survival in the desert.
Yeah, which otherwise, I mean, 5th edition goes out of its way to avoid dealing with survival elements. Like, they try to get rid of them.
Good, Barry. The folks are still there in the chat, you know, drop some messages if you have any more questions, comments. Otherwise, I think we covered everything pretty well. Get to the point where take a bio break anyway. So this is a good place to call it.
Yes, I agree. Like, comment, subscribe, and share.